What is crack-a-lackin', ladies and gentlemen? We have right here in front of us a RX 6700 XT 12GB. Now, we picked this up off the used market just now for an absolute bargain, 250 Aussie dollars. Now, this actually came to me via someone I was selling a PC to in the past. They're upgrading their system and they just said, do you want the graphics card? And I said, sure, how much? And they said, well, 250 Aussie dollars. And I'm thinking, okay, well, let's check out the condition of it. Checked it out, and it looks like it is actually all okay and good to go. And now what we're gonna do today is we're gonna get back to the studio and test this thing out and see how it compares to some of these newer cards like the 5060 Ti and the 9060 XT. Because this card right here, I think the 12GB is just a perfect balance for a more budget-orientated card, especially if you're just looking for pure value. But we'll find out with the benchmarks right after today's video sponsor.
Do you need to get Windows 10 or Windows 11 activated and don't want to spend $200 or some other exorbitant price? Well, if so, today's video sponsor VIP SCD Keys has you covered. For as little as $15 using the coupon code BFTYC, you can get Windows 10 activated. For a little bit more, you can get Windows 11 activated too. Links in the description below to find out more.
So right now, I'm finding the used market is an absolute mixed bag where you can get bargains like this, but then if you look on eBay, for instance, you just see there's so many cards out there that are just simply overpriced. So what I'm looking at personally is I'm always sifting through my local marketplace as well as going on eBay as well and just constantly looking for different cards that could be underpriced versus what people are usually asking for them. But more importantly, what cards are going for new and the price performance up in my head of kind of what this card or where this card should sit at versus those new prices. So that's what I'm really curious about with this 6700 XT, because usually when I look on eBay, they're going for about 350 Aussie dollars plus, which would be around, I guess, around 250 USD plus. And so if you come across an RX 6700 XT for this price, is it going to make for some of the best value you can get on the used market? Well, there's only one way to answer that. Let's put this thing on the test bench and see how it performs. So we're now coming to you guys the next day with the results on the 6700 XT. Would have got it done yesterday, but we finished off the $100 flip up challenge, episode 3, which you can check out. I'll put the link right up here for you. And also I'm gonna be doing some further tests for that series, just outside of the series, because people were very curious about the CPU and motherboard. Anyhow, let's get on to the results here with the 6700 XT, where it makes for a bit of a wild set of tests and numbers. But let's start off with some latest and greatest games like Dune Awakening, where here's where the optimization is leaving the 6700 XT behind when it comes to comparing this graphics card versus, say, the 5060 Ti 16GB or the 9060 XT 16GB, which I'll just refer to them from here on in, the 16GB models without the 16GB, just to save me some breath and save your ears some spam. Though, in this game, it needs a bit more optimization for sure with the 6700 XT because it is falling quite behind. On to Marvel Rivals, here is where it does yet again fall behind, especially at 1080p. But then if we start going 1440p and 4K, does start to scale back some of that performance. And this is a general trend with the exception of one game that you will see across the tests that we're doing here. But it almost feels like since we're on the new RDNA architecture, the older RDNA architectures do get left behind from AMD, I feel, a bit more than they should. And so I feel like AMD needs to go back and optimize some of these older cards a bit better, because we will see with this next result here, Elden Ring, that the 6700 XT does get a dub over the 9060 XT. Even though it loses on the 0.1% lows, I feel like AMD really haven't got across to optimizing this for the 9060 XT yet. And even though it's pretty much 60 FPS bound at 1440p and 1080p, at 4K we do start to extract a little bit of a difference there, and we get some interesting insight that shows that the 6700 XT does have some pure performance still left under the hood. And then we go over to Splitgate now, the next title. This is a multiplayer online title predominantly. It's free to play, actually a great game. Here's where at 1080p, the 6700 XT does weird. Like, it is the optimal resolution for this card, because at 1440p and 4K, it just started stuttering. So looks like, just like some of the other games that we've tested here, the optimization needs to come in with the form of a driver update to really get this card running at its peak potential. But it looks like at 1080p for this particular game on the 6700 XT, there are no bottlenecks that seem to ensue. Though, going over to Final Fantasy 16 also shows that the raw performance isn't that bad. This is a game where I found it does favor kind of Radeon's architecture versus Nvidia's architecture, but that said, it also favors the higher, I guess, bit bus of the 6700 XT over the 9060 XT, where it's only really coming across about 5% faster for the 9060 XT and about 9% faster for the 5060 Ti. So not bad, depending on what resolution we look at, in this case 1440p. At 1080p, the 128-bit bus cards do start to pull a little bit ahead though, more so than 1440p and 4K. However, here's where we go on to the next title here, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and there is a massive difference here where the 5060 Ti is about 42% faster at 1080p than the 6700 XT, and then the 9060 XT is about 25% faster. But then if we go on to 4K, we can see that it drops down from 42% to 33% on the 5060 Ti's winning margin, and that also drops down to 18% on the 9060 XT's winning margins. So the scaling does favor the 6700 XT in the majority of these titles, because we'll move over to the second last title here for raw performance, and that's Fortnite, where we see the exact opposite of what we saw in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, where at 1080p, the 6700 XT does a lot better in terms of scaling versus 4K, where these other cards start to pull out far ahead than they did at 1080p. Now, I believe this is more so got to do with the forced ray tracing elements that are in Fortnite, as well as when we test the next game out here, Riftbreaker, I decided to leave ray tracing on because it's actually pretty light and the total FPS numbers are usually pretty decent on mid-range to high-end cards that I don't have to worry too much about ray tracing. But here is where the 6700 XT then does start to fall behind quite significantly, especially versus the other titles where there's no ray tracing on. And so we can see that the ray tracing performance is at least the Achilles heel on the older used AMD graphics cards, where we'll showcase this difference with, for instance, Black Myth, where although it's bad on the 9060 XT, it's horrible on the 6700 XT, where the performance just drops off a cliff. But then if we go over the other ray tracing example here that doesn't bake a whole lot of heavy ray tracing into the game, even if you turn it on max settings, it does a lot better in this particular title. So when the ray tracing is heavy, the 6700 XT does suffer more so than the 9060 XT, which then that also suffers more than the 5060 Ti. So it looks like Nvidia still have their dominance on ray tracing, but as I've said in previous videos that I've been doing lately, talking about graphics cards, I haven't been that impressed with ray tracing. A few of you guys gave out some good recommendations for games that are worth turning it on for, but in general, it seems like it's not a whole lot of games out there that really benefit from ray tracing, especially in terms of what you're getting in the visual fidelity versus the FPS that you're losing turning this technology on. Though the final thing to talk about here is the power consumption of the 6700 XT. Now you're wondering, this thing is about 4.5 years old now, Brian. Surely it is going to do a pretty poor job when it comes to efficiency. And out of the box, actually not so much. I decided to run the tests here in Dune Awakening, especially at 1080p, as well as different resolutions for the default settings. But then I decided to also overclock and undervolt all three of these cards in today's results. And here's where the 6700 XT benefits immensely from undervolting. And it drops the power consumption down a heap without hitting your FPS so much. Now versus the 128-bit bus cards, they do undervolt differently. The 9060 XT I feel doesn't benefit as much from the undervolting as say the 5060 Ti does. Whereas you can see here, that 77 watts, that was extremely impressive at 1080p on Dune Awakening, where that's just coming in with better FPS figures than the 6700 XT, but using 77 watts. So really taking some time to tune the GPU to your liking can net you some really cool gains depending on which card you decide to go with. But the 6700 XT, definitely worth undervolting. You can extract much better efficiency out of the card to the point where I'm still really impressed with this card, even nearly 4.5 years on. Now, this is where we're going to talk about the conclusion on this card and the value, because that's what it ultimately always boils down to. And I know there's other people out there that look at things like the ROG motherboards, they want the aesthetics, they look at this particular case and they love that stuff. I'm always just looking at value, everything I do. And so over the years, I just keep finding myself being more and more passionate about the used market because there's always going to be that chance that you can get a really good deal. Now, speaking of the prices, here's where it just boils down to the price with the 6700 XT. It all depends on what you can get this for on the used market. I feel like the current market prices on eBay are too high for this card. For instance, if I was in Australia, I wouldn't be paying 450 or 500 Aussie dollars. And then if I'm in the US, I wouldn't be paying over 250 USD for this card. I'd be looking for this card for about 200 USD or under. I feel like that's a fair price for it on the used market, considering it is over 4 years old now, and you do run those risks of going on the used market. And the performance is still a chunk lower than the 5060 Ti and the 9060 XT, especially those 16GB models. And they've also, at least from the last time I've checked, the 9060 XT 16GB can be had for about $370 at this point in time, making it about $20 cheaper on the street prices than when I last checked it. So when something on the used market's kind of going up in price and it's remaining pretty high, and something on the new market's coming down in price, this is where the new market definitely balances out the used market. But in terms of what I'd pay for this card at this point in time, it's around 200 USD and especially lower, which I got this one in today's video for 160-ish USD roughly, which in Australian dollars, which is what I paid for it, it was exactly 250 Aussie dollars. And with all that out of the way, hope you enjoyed today's revisit of the 6700 XT. Now, there are some other variants out there like the 6750 XT. Should definitely keep your eye on one of them, or the 6700 non-XT. And these can go for really cheap prices on the used market too. So for me personally, I'm always looking at all these different cards. The RX 6000 series in particular from AMD was one of my favorite series that they launched. It was just a really hard-hitting competitive architecture, especially at the time versus NVIDIA, but also the flexibility of what you could do with the cards in terms of undervolting was also really impressive too. So this one here, the 6700 XT, I feel like it's one of the most relevant out of the bunch just because it had a great balance of the efficiency as well as the FPS, and also in terms of its price, it wasn't too bad. Though do let us know in the comments section below what you think of the 6700 XT in 2025, and how much would you be prepared to pay for one if you did want one. If you don't want one, do let us know also in the comment section below. And with that aside, I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.